I'm going to invite up Alison as she comes to preach this morning, so help me welcome Alison as she comes.
Good morning, everyone. As Mike mentioned, my name is Alison, and I'm one of the pastors here at the River. It's so good to be here with you this morning. So today, we are returning to our summer sermon series called Living with Intention. During this series, we've been taking a look at some of the cultural waters that we swim in, and we've been considering some of the ways that faith may be able to help us navigate these waters with intention. Ways that faith can help us move toward life in all its fullness that God intends for us. So I'm sure we've all heard the question, are you someone who views the cup as half empty or half full? The gist of this question is, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Do you tend to look on the bright side of things or to expect the worst to happen? This binary is interesting to me. On the one hand, it seems a little bit helpful. Better understanding our own dispositions, tendencies, and conditioning is important work. But at the same time, it feels limiting. Are these really the only two options available to us? Do we really have to choose between despair and cynicism on the one hand and toxic positivity on the other? And aren't there valuable aspects to each position? Isn't it important to view the world with clear eyes and accept reality, and also to find ways to move forward and make meaning? Yet, more often than not, we are encouraged to exclusively be half-glass full people. In our cultural context, we more easily understand the downsides of living in the extremes of despair and cynicism. Anyone who has experienced hopelessness knows how heavy, painful, and paralyzing such feelings can be. But the pitfalls of extreme positivity may be less obvious to us. Positive thinking can be incredibly helpful. It can be a wonderful coping skill to help us navigate tough times. But like with anything, when taken to the extreme, it can become toxic. Psychologists define toxic positivity as the overgeneralization of a happy, optimistic state that results in the denial, minimization, and invalidation of the authentic human emotional experience. Positivity becomes toxic when it is used to deny, minimize, and invalidate. When instead of helping us feel things like gratitude, joy, and hope, it instead leads us to feel misunderstood, isolated, and ashamed. Have you ever shared about the ways that you are struggling and been told to look on the bright side, think positive, or find the silver lining, when what you really needed was for the person just to listen and empathize? That is toxic positivity. Toxic positivity also shows up as social media feeds that are good vibes only, or the inner voice that says, I shouldn't feel this way. It could be so much worse after all. Toxic positivity tells us that emotions like sadness, grief, anger, frustration, anxiety, fear, loneliness, or stress are bad and unacceptable. And so when we experience these perfectly natural human emotions, we can start to believe that we are doing something wrong, that we are handling things badly, that we are bad people for not being more positive or having more faith. And this can lead us to begin to feel shame. It can also lead us to begin suppressing our emotions. Instead of allowing ourselves to feel our emotions and work through them, we will sometimes try to deny them and bury them inside. Unfortunately, this doesn't actually make them go away. Buried emotions can resurface as depression, anxiety, and or physical pain or illness, among other things. Sometimes toxic positivity is wrapped up in religious language. When this happens, it is called spiritual bypassing, because spirituality is being used as a way to bypass painful emotions. But the thing is, toxic positivity and spiritual bypassing are not biblical. For example, take a look at the Psalms. The psalmists did not shy away from expressing their true feelings. Take Psalm 22. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. Wow, what a description of the psalmist's pain. Instead of judging their painful emotions as bad and shutting them down, this author leaned into them and gave them space. The psalmist took the time to process them by putting them into words and expressing them to God. Jesus didn't deny his emotions either. When his friend Lazarus died, he didn't force a positive outlook by saying things like, everything happens for a reason, or God is in control. Instead, he allowed himself to feel his grief and to weep. Later, in anticipation of being arrested and killed, Jesus told his friends, I am deeply grieved, even to death, before throwing himself on the ground to pray. And so I would like to offer an additional alternative beyond the choices of despair and cynicism on the one hand and toxic positivity on the other. That is tragic optimism. The term tragic optimism was first coined by psychologist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. Frankl described tragic optimism as the ability to maintain hope and find meaning in life despite its inescapable pain, loss, and suffering. Frankl was looking to create a framework that acknowledged the reality of tremendous suffering in the world, like what he had experienced during the Holocaust, and that also provided a path forward. Now, I'm not advocating that Frankl's framework in particular is perfect and that we should adopt it, absolutely. But I do think this concept of tragic optimism can help point us in the right direction. For example, tragic optimism reminds us of the importance of honoring the complexity of the human experience, both its tremendous pain and incredible beauty. One of the reasons we sometimes get sucked into toxic positivity is because we forget that it is possible to feel multiple, sometimes conflicting emotions at the same time. We falsely believe that being sad means we can't also feel hopeful, or that being frustrated means we can't also feel grateful. But this isn't true. We are capable of feeling many things at the same time. There's a wonderful example of this in one of Paul's letters to the church in Corinth. Paul said this, "For it is the God who said, 'Light will shine out of darkness,' who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying around in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For we who are living are always being handed over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you." Paul was describing the suffering he and his companions were experiencing as they sought to spread the good news about Jesus. It is significant that Paul did not deny the extent of their suffering and the tremendous impact it was having on them. He acknowledged that they were afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, and struck down. Yet he also shared that at the same time, they also felt hope, comfort, and motivation to persevere. These emotions did not cancel each other out. Instead, they coexisted. How were Paul and his companions able to embrace this kind of complexity? It's impossible for us to know for sure, but from the text, it looks like they were able to make some kind of meaning out of the suffering they were experiencing. Finding ways to make meaning out of suffering is a key element of tragic optimism. Now, before we dive into how Paul went about making meaning, let me be clear. We do not have to agree with Paul or choose to make meaning out of our own suffering in the same way that he did. And it is incredibly important to remember that we always have choice when it comes to making meaning. We get to decide if, when, and how to do this kind of work for ourselves. Others can't do it for us, and we can't do it for others. So with those caveats out of the way, let's take a look. Paul said, "For it is the God who said, 'Light will shine out of darkness,' who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us." According to Paul, the same God who brought light into being by speaking was working in his heart and in those of his companions. God was shining light in their hearts to help them better understand the nature of God. God did this by helping them to see the face of Jesus. This inner work that God was doing in them was precious and powerful. It was a valuable treasure that they carried around in them wherever they went. And yet, as vessels, they felt like breakable clay jars. For Paul and his companions, the contrast between the power of God in them and their own weakness was striking and palpable. Why would God allow such precious treasure to be carried in such fragile vessels? Paul concluded that it was so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. Paul concluded that their human weakness, the source of their suffering, was meant to remind themselves and others that God was the source of their power. Thus, their weakness was not a failure or a design flaw, but rather a design feature intended to keep them humble and to bring glory to God. Paul went on to say that they were always carrying around in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For we who are living are always being handed over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. For Paul, part of what it meant to follow Jesus was to carry around and actively take part in Jesus' death and resurrection again and again. For Paul, every time he suffered, when he was afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, and struck down, he was experiencing death alongside Jesus. And every time he felt the Spirit of God move in him, when he felt comforted, hopeful, and motivated to persevere, he was joining Jesus in his resurrection. According to the passage, Paul participated in this cycle in order to help make God visible and known to others. And in this way, Paul felt that his suffering was meaningful both for himself and for others. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do not have to agree with Paul or choose to make meaning out of our suffering in the same ways that he did. But I think we can learn from his approach. Paul looked at the suffering he and his companions were experiencing and sought to connect it to a larger story. According to the story, the narrative that Paul told himself, the meaning that he made out of his hardship, Paul's weakness was not a failure or a liability. God was actively present and working for his good, and God was able to bring good things out of his suffering. It was not all for naught. So at this point, you may be wondering, how does this meaning-making process differ from the toxic positivity I spoke about earlier? There are a few key ways. The first is, tragic optimism does not deny life's inescapable pain, loss, and suffering. Too often, our impulse is to skip this part and go straight to the meaning-making. And this is when we fall into the trap of toxic positivity. But if we want to be people who experience greater healing and wholeness in our own lives, who cling to hope instead of empty optimism, and who create space for others to do the same, we cannot do this. Instead, we must slow down. We must see our lives and the world with clear eyes. We must take stock of the wreckage. And we need to sit with all of our feelings, including the painful and uncomfortable ones, just like Paul and his companions did. In their book, Good Enough, Kate Bowler, author and professor at Duke Divinity School, and her co-writer Jessica Ritchie put it this way: before hope comes acknowledgement. Let us count not only our blessings, but our losses. That might sound negative to people accustomed to leaning on optimism, but there are good reasons for starting with a deep accounting of loss. Honesty allows us a moment to pause and take stock before we forge ahead. This process of counting our losses, grieving, and sitting with our feelings can be frustratingly slow. But only once we have done this can we begin to make meaning beyond empty platitudes, to begin to connect our suffering to a larger story, to begin to see the beautiful that may emerge alongside the terrible, to begin to practice hope as a form of protest. Another way that tragic optimism differs from toxic positivity is that it is a process we get to enter into by choice. Others cannot make meaning for us, and we cannot make meaning for others. When people we love are suffering, our primary job is to be with them and to support them as they seek to make sense of their own story, not to make sense of their story for them. As we are instructed in Romans 12:15, we should seek to meet people where they are at, to rejoice with them as they are rejoicing, to weep with them as they are weeping, to enter into what they are actually feeling and experiencing, not what we think they should be. And this starts with ourselves. Do we allow ourselves to rejoice when it's time to rejoice? To weep when it's time to weep? Do we allow ourselves to experience each of our emotions as they arise? Or do we shut them down in favor of what we think we should be feeling? If and when we are ready to engage in meaning making, God will be there ready to help. But we do not need to rush ourselves or others to get to this step prematurely. A third way that tragic optimism differs from toxic positivity is that its form of hope is not empty. By this I mean that hope, unlike empty optimism, does not make false promises. Hope does not promise the impossible. Hope does not guarantee specific outcomes or freedom from pain in this lifetime, but it does help us to keep going, to find reasons to keep living, to keep pursuing truth, beauty, goodness, and love, even as we suffer. Kate Bowler puts it this way: Hope is not made out of certainty. It is made out of necessity. This is so often where the followers of Jesus get confused. You can be certain there is a God, you can be certain of God's presence, but you can't be certain about everything. Hope is what gives you a way to go on, even if you are not going to get relief from ordinary and extraordinary pain, even when your loved one has died, even if your partner does not come back, even if you don't get to see the culmination of your own dreams. People who are hopeful know all about fear. Hope is seeing reality and having the courage to keep going, to keep moving, to keep loving, and to keep hoping. This understanding of hope is far more expansive, and it allows us both to embrace the reality of life's pain and to open our eyes to life's beauty. So throughout this sermon series, we want to create space for you to reflect and practice some of the things that we've been talking about. So at the end of each sermon, we've been carving out time for that, and we'll do that again today. So for those of you in this room, we'll hand out printed sheets of paper with reflection questions, and there should be pens at your seats. If not, grab one from an empty chair nearby. And then we'll spend about 6 to 7 minutes reflecting individually before we come back together for musical worship. For those of you joining via live stream, the questions will be projected on the screen. But before we move into reflection, let me end by praying a benediction over us. As we face our losses and seek to make meaning of our suffering, may we discover that God is right there with us. May we internalize that there is no emotion that makes us bad or that disconnects us from God, and that there is no emotion that makes us good or holy. May we discover a hope beyond empty optimism and be filled with the courage we need to keep going, to keep moving, to keep loving, and to keep hoping. Amen. All right, so now we'll spend the next 6 or 7 minutes reflecting, and then we'll come back together for some musical worship.